A quiet afternoon in a sunny suburb. Kids play on the sidewalk. Neighbors tend to their lawns. Daniel Carter, a 42-year-old single father, is hunched over an engine in his garage. His hands are stained with oil. His 10-year-old daughter, Emily, sits nearby doing homework on a stool. Suddenly, a silver sedan pulls up. A woman steps out, looking lost. "Excuse me, do you know someone who can look at a car problem?" Daniel wipes his hands and steps into the light. He opens the hood. They talk like strangers. Then she mentions Seattle. Daniel freezes. He looks at her face. It's her. Now. Daniel Carter was a man who lived in the quiet architecture of routine. At 42, his face was a map of hard-won peace, etched with the subtle lines of a man who had traded the noise of a high-stakes career for the rhythmic clinking of wrenches in a suburban garage. He was the owner of a small independent auto repair shop run right out of his home. He wasn't a man of flashy displays or expensive labels. He preferred the smell of motor oil to the scent of corporate boardrooms. In Oak Haven, he was simply known as the guy who could fix anything with an engine and a soul. Daniel's life was a master class in aggressive simplicity. He was a single father, a role he had embraced with a fierce, quiet devotion. Since his marriage ended 7 years ago in a blur of tears and closed doors, Daniel had systematically dismantled his old life. He had walked away from the high-pressure sales world in the city. He had moved to this quiet street because it had a park 3 blocks away and a school with a good music program. He didn't need the executive title anymore. He just needed to be the father who was there for every breakfast, every soccer game, and every Tuesday night science project. His daughter Emily was 10 years old. She was the light that kept the shadows of the past at bay. She was observant, kind, and possessed a wisdom that often caught Daniel off guard. Every afternoon after school, she would set up her office on a high wooden stool in the corner of the garage. She liked the sound of her father working, the rhythmic clank of tools and the steady hum of the radio. It was their sanctuary. They were a team of 2, a unit that felt solid and unbreakable. Daniel never spoke about the woman who had once been his world. He didn't keep photos on the mantelpiece, and he didn't check social media for updates. He assumed she was long gone, living the fast-paced, high-status life she had always craved, the life he couldn't provide back when they were young and drowning in debt. He was content with the silence. He was happy with his tools and his daughter. On this particular Tuesday, the sun was casting long golden shadows across the driveway. Daniel was working on an old pickup truck, trying to diagnose a stubborn fuel pump issue. The neighborhood was peaceful, the air smelling of fresh-cut grass and coming rain. He was focused, his world narrowed down to the metal in front of him. He didn't look up when the silver sedan pulled over at the curb. He didn't look up when the car door clicked open. He only stood up when he heard a voice that sounded like a haunting melody from a dream he had long since forgotten. It was a voice that asked for help, and in that moment, Daniel Carter had no idea that the neighborly help he was about to offer would force him to face the ghost he had spent 7 years running away from. The woman stood by the open door of the silver sedan, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. She looked out of place in this quiet, blue-collar suburb, wearing a tailored trench coat and polished boots that weren't designed for walking on gravel. "Excuse me," she said again, her voice carrying a soft, hesitant tone. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just moved into the house at the end of the block. My car started making this strange clicking noise every time I accelerate. A neighbor said you were the person to talk to." Daniel wiped his hands on a dark rag, his movements slow and practiced. He stepped out of the shadows of the garage and into the light. He didn't look at her face at first. His eyes were drawn to the car. He saw a well-maintained mid-range sedan. To a mechanic, a car is just a system of logic. "Clicking under acceleration?" Daniel asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Could be a CV joint, or maybe just a loose heat shield. Pop the hood, I'll take a look." "Ah, Roy." The woman nodded, relieved. She reached inside the car and pulled the lever. As the hood hissed open, Daniel approached. He worked with a surgical efficiency, checking the fluid levels and the belt tension. While he worked, the woman stood a few feet back, watching him with a curious, analytical gaze. "I'm Laura," she said, trying to fill the heavy silence between them. I've been moving in all morning. It's a lot more work than I remember. Daniel gave a small, non-committal nod. Moving always is. I'm Daniel. This is Emily. He gestured with his head toward the girl on the stool. Emily hopped down, her curiosity winning over her math homework. Hi, are you the lady in the blue house? I saw the big truck there this morning. Laura Mim Kwai smiled, a genuine, warm expression that made her eyes crinkle. I am, Emily. It's nice to meet you. You have a very impressive office here. The conversation flowed naturally, like two neighbors who had just met. They talked about the school district, the best place to find groceries, and the quiet rhythm of the street. Daniel found himself relaxing. He liked the way she spoke, direct but kind. He noticed that she didn't treat him like the help. She treated him like a professional. It's a nice change of pace here, Laura noted, looking down the street where a group of kids were racing bikes. I used to live in Seattle. It was all glass buildings and frantic energy. I realized recently that I missed the sound of trees and the feeling of having a front porch. The word Seattle hit Daniel like a physical strike. He stopped checking the spark plugs. His breath caught in his throat. He had lived in Seattle once. He had been a different man there. He had been a man who wore suits and checked stock prices every hour. He had been a man who was married to a woman who loved the city as much as she loved him. Seattle? Daniel asked, his voice suddenly sounding tight. Yes, Laura replied, her gaze drifting to the horizon. A long time ago, before life got complicated, I think I spent too many years chasing things that didn't actually matter. Daniel didn't respond. He looked down at the engine, but he wasn't seeing the wires anymore. He was seeing a rainy apartment on the 12th floor. He was seeing a woman standing by a window telling him that she couldn't breathe in a life that felt like a trap. He realized then that he hadn't looked at this woman's face. Not really. He had seen the neighbor. He had seen the client, but he hadn't seen the past. He slowly lowered the hood of the car. The metallic thud sounded like a gavel in the quiet afternoon. He turned around, his hands trembling slightly as he tucked the rag into his pocket. He looked at her. He looked past the expensive coat and the polished boots. He looked into those hazel eyes. The air in the garage seemed to vanish. The sound of the children playing faded into a dull, distant hum. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, the world stood still. Daniel Carter stared at the woman standing in his driveway, and for the first time in 7 years, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was deafening. He knew that face. He knew every line, every shadow, every secret hidden behind those eyes. He was looking at his neighbor, but he was also looking at the woman who had walked out on him when his world was at its darkest. The sunlight was unforgiving. It hit Laura's face directly, highlighting the subtle changes time had made. A few fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a certain weariness in her posture that hadn't been there before. But the essence of her remained unchanged. Laura, Daniel whispered. It wasn't a question. It was an involuntary release of air. Laura froze. She had been looking at Emily, but at the sound of her name spoken in that specific, gravelly baritone, her head snapped back to Daniel. She squinted, her brow furrowing in confusion. Then realization, then a shock so profound it made her stumble back an inch. Daniel, her voice was a breathy, fragile thing. They stood there separated by 5 feet of concrete and 7 years of unanswered questions. Emily looked between her father and the new neighbor, her small face mirroring the confusion of the moment. Dad, you know her? Is she from the city? Daniel didn't answer his daughter. He couldn't. His mind was a chaotic storm of memories. He remembered the final month in Seattle, the debt from his failed startup, the medical bills that had piled up after his father's passing, the way he had shut down, becoming a ghost in his own home. And he remembered the day he came back from a job interview to find the closet empty and a note on the kitchen table that simply said, I can't do this anymore. I need to find myself again. He had hated her for years. Then he had pitied her. Then eventually he had simply forgotten her, or so he told himself. I didn't realize you lived here, Laura said, her eyes shimmering with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. She looked at the garage, the old truck, the grease on his face. You? You're a mechanic? Daniel gave a short, dry laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor. I fix things, Laura. It turns out I'm better at fixing machines than I am at fixing other things. I've been here for 5 years. Emily and we built this. Laura's gaze moved back to Emily. She looked at the girl, really looked at her. She saw the shape of the jawline that matched Daniel's and the eyes that were a mirror of her own. She saw a version of her daughter that she hadn't seen since she was a toddler in pigtails. She's so big, Laura whispered, her hand moving instinctively toward her heart. She's 10, Daniel said, his voice regaining its protective edge. She's a straight A student. She plays the violin, and she knows how to change a tire. She grew up, Laura, while you were finding yourself. The bitterness in his voice was a physical force. Laura looked down at her polished boots, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. The CEO persona she had built in the city was useless here. On this driveway, she was just a woman who had run away when the weather got cold. I know what you think of me, Daniel, Laura said softly, not looking up. And I don't blame you. Every word you're thinking, I've said it to myself 1,000 times in the dark. I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I was a coward. I thought that if I stayed, I would just drown with you. I didn't realize that drowning together was the whole point. Daniel didn't move. He felt a surge of anger, followed by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He looked at his garage, the sanctuary he had built with his own 2 hands. He looked at Emily, who was now standing close to his side, clutching the hem of his coveralls. He realized that for 7 years he had been defining himself by her absence. He had become a single dad as a badge of honor, a shield against the world that had hurt him. But seeing her here, in his world, he realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't afraid of her anymore. She didn't have the power to break him. He had already been broken and put back together with stronger welds. The car is fixed, Laura, Daniel said, his voice now calm and clinical. It was a loose bracket on the exhaust manifold. 10-minute fix. You don't owe me anything. Welcome to the neighborhood. He turned back toward the pickup truck, picking up his wrench. It was a dismissal. He was ready to go back to his routine. He was ready for the past to remain the past. But Laura didn't move. She stood by her silver sedan, looking at the man she had once called her husband and the daughter she had abandoned. She saw the life he had built, the simple, honest, and beautiful life. And she realized that she was the one who was truly poor. Daniel, wait, she pleaded. I didn't move here because I knew you were here. I swear, it was a relocation through the agency. I just wanted a fresh start. I didn't know. Daniel stopped, his back to her. I believe you, Laura. The universe has a strange sense of humor. But here's the truth. Emily and I are doing fine. We have a life. We have a rhythm. I don't know why you're here, but don't bring the city chaos to this street. We like the quiet. Emily looked up at her dad, her eyes full of questions she wasn't ready to ask. She saw the tension in his shoulders and the sadness in the woman's eyes. She realized then that this wasn't just a neighbor. This was a chapter of a book she hadn't been allowed to read. Laura looked at the silver sedan, the car that was now running perfectly thanks to the hands of the man she had left behind. She realized then that Daniel hadn't just fixed her car. He had shown her the person she could have been if she had been brave enough to stay. I'll leave you alone, Daniel, Laura whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I promise. I'm glad she's okay. I'm glad you're both okay. She got into the car and closed the door. The engine purred to life, smooth, quiet, and reliable. Daniel watched the silver car pull away, disappearing around the corner of the quiet street. He stood there for a long time, the wrench heavy in his hand, the smell of oil and jasmine still lingering in the air. He realized then that the past doesn't come back to hurt us. It comes back to show us how far we've come. He looked down at Emily, who was still holding his hand. Dad? She asked softly. Was she the one in the note? Daniel knelt down and pulled his daughter into a tight hug. She was a ghost, Emily, but ghosts can't stay in the sunlight. Let's go make dinner. The evening was quiet, but the air inside the house felt different. The pancake protocol was in effect. It was their way of dealing with a hard day by having breakfast for dinner. Daniel flipped a pancake with a practiced flick of his wrist, his mind still in the driveway. Emily sat at the small wooden table, her fork tracing patterns in her syrup. She had been quiet since the silver car left. She was a child of logic, much like her father, and she was currently trying to process a massive new piece of data. "Dad," Emily began, her voice small but steady, "you always told me that Mommy had to go away to work. You said she was busy building a dream." Daniel paused, the spatula hovering over the griddle. He looked at the steam rising from the coffee. He had told her that lie because it was easier than the truth. He didn't want his daughter to grow up thinking she wasn't enough to make someone stay. "I did say that, Emily," Daniel admitted, sitting down across from her. "And for a long time I believed it was the only story you needed to hear." "But she didn't look like a dream builder," Emily said, looking him straight in the eyes. "She looked like she was sorry. She looked like the girl in the story who gets lost in the woods and forgets how to find her house." Daniel sighed, a long, weary sound. He realized that his daughter was no longer a child who could be protected by fairy tales. She was a person who deserved the truth, however messy it might be. "We lived in Seattle, Emily, a long time ago. Your mother and I, we were young. We thought that success meant having a big office and a fast car. When things got hard, when my business failed and we lost the house, your mother got scared. She didn't know how to live in the quiet. She thought that if she left, she could find the life she lost." "Did she find it?" Emily asked. "I don't know," Daniel replied honestly. "She looked successful today. She had a nice car and expensive clothes, but she also looked lonely. I think she realized that a dream life without the people you love is just a very big, empty house." Emily nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "Are you still mad at her?" Daniel thought about the wrench in the garage. He thought about the 7 years of silence. "I was mad for a long time, Emily. I spent years carrying that anger like a heavy toolbox. But today, when I looked at her, I realized I was just tired. I'm not mad anymore. I'm just glad we're here." Across the neighborhood, in the blue house at the end of the block, Laura Bennett sat in her living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The house was cold, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. She looked at the keys to her car on the counter. Daniel had fixed the clicking. The machine was perfect. But her own life was a series of broken systems. She had reached the top of her field in marketing. She had the penthouse. She had the title. But she had spent her nights staring at a city of millions, feeling entirely invisible. She had moved back to Oak Haven not for a promotion, but for a memory. She had hoped that by returning to a place that felt like home, she might find the piece of herself she had left on that kitchen table 7 years ago. She hadn't known Daniel was here. She had expected to find a town where she was a stranger. But the universe had played a surgical trick on her. It had placed her right back in the path of the man who had loved her when she had nothing. She walked to the window and looked down the street. She could see the light on in Daniel's garage. She thought about the way he held Emily's shoulder. The same protective, unshakable way he used to hold her. She realized then that Daniel hadn't just survived her departure. He had thrived. He had become the man he was always meant to be. She picked up a small framed photo from a box, a picture of a tiny baby in a Seattle hospital. It was the only thing she had kept. She traced the glass with her thumb. "I was so wrong," she whispered to the empty room. The next morning, as Daniel was walking Emily to the bus stop, he saw Laura. She was in her front yard, struggling with a heavy box of books. She didn't call out to him. She didn't try to make eye contact. She simply kept working, her head down. Daniel stopped at the curb. He looked at his daughter, then at the woman at the end of the block. He realized that the quiet he wanted for his street wasn't the same as the peace he wanted for his heart. Peace doesn't come from ignoring the past. It comes from acknowledging it and moving forward. "Wait here a sec, pal," Daniel told Emily. He walked down the sidewalk. He didn't rush. He didn't have his mechanic face on. He arrived at Laura's yard and reached down, picking up the other end of the box. "You're lifting with your back, Laura," Daniel said, his voice neutral but not cold. "Use your legs. Otherwise, you'll be back in my garage tomorrow with a different kind of repair." Laura looked up, startled. A flicker of hope, small and fragile, appeared in her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel." "Don't mention it," he said, helping her carry the box to the porch. He didn't stay to talk. He didn't ask her for coffee. He simply nodded and walked back to Emily. But as he took his daughter's hand and continued toward the bus stop, the air felt a little lighter. He was still a single dad. He was still a mechanic. But for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't a widower of a living marriage. He was just a man who had helped his neighbor with a heavy load. And that was a very good place to start. 3 months later, the silver sedan was a permanent fixture at the end of the block. The blue house was no longer cold. It was filled with books, art, and the occasional sound of a violin. The relationship between Daniel, Laura, and Emily didn't transform into a cinematic reunion overnight. Life isn't a movie. There were no dramatic declarations of love in the rain. Instead, there were small, quiet moments of growth. There were neighborly check-ins. There were conversations over the backyard fence about the best fertilizer for tomatoes. There were awkward dinners where the silence was slowly replaced by the sound of Emily's stories. Daniel realized that he didn't need to protect Emily from her mother anymore. He needed to teach her how to forgive. And in doing so, he found that he was finally forgiving himself for not being able to fix their marriage all those years ago. Laura stayed in Oak Haven. She kept her remote job in the city, but she spent her afternoons at the local library helping with the youth art program. She didn't try to be mom right away. She was Laura. She was the lady at the end of the block who had a really cool collection of pencils and knew how to draw buildings that didn't have shadows. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel was in the garage. He was finishing a complex restoration of a vintage engine. The sun was setting, painting the driveway in shades of deep amber. He heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Engine trouble?" Daniel asked, wiping a smudge of grease from his forehead. "No," Laura said, leaning against the doorframe. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, the uniform of her new life. "I just wanted to see if the lead mechanic was free for a walk. Emily is at a sleepover, and I thought the street was a bit too quiet." Daniel set his wrench down on the workbench. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had fixed her car and helped her with her boxes. He realized that they weren't stained by the past anymore. They were just the hands of a man who knew how to maintain a good thing. "I think I can manage that," Daniel said, a real smile finally breaking through. They walked down the street together, their shadows long and thin on the pavement. They didn't talk about Seattle. They didn't talk about the debt or the departure. They talked about the new park equipment and the upcoming neighborhood bake-off. As they reached the end of the block, Daniel stopped and looked back at his house. He saw the garage doors closed and the lights on in the kitchen. He realized then that the story of his life wasn't about the woman who left him. It was about the man who stayed. It was about the resilience of the single dad who built a sanctuary out of grease and grit. And it was about the realization that sometimes the past doesn't come back to haunt us. It comes back to see if we're ready to let the light in. Daniel took a deep breath of the cool evening air. He felt solid. He felt present. He looked at Laura and realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fix her. He was just walking with her. "You know, Daniel," Laura said, looking up at the stars, "I'm glad my car broke down on this street." "Me too, Laura," Daniel replied, ruffling his hair. "Me too." The story of the single dad and the neighbor didn't end with a vow. It ended with a quiet, honest connection between two people who had finally learned that true success isn't about the view from the top floor. It's about who you're walking with when the sun goes down. And as the first stars appeared over Oak Haven, Daniel Carter knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. He was home. If you believe that life sometimes brings the past back just to show you how much you've grown, hit subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you ever give someone from your past a second chance? Or is the quiet of the present too valuable to risk?